The bolt cutters gleamed in the December moonlight as Margaret stepped through the freshly cut hole in the Johnsons' fence. Her HOA president badge caught the glow from 30,000 Christmas lights blazing across their front yard, casting rainbow shadows on her determined face. "This ends tonight," she whispered to herself, pulling out her phone to record, which she'd later call Exhibit A in the case against neighborhood terrorism. Behind her, the chain-link fence gaped open like a wound. She'd spent 20 minutes cutting through it, muttering about property values and reasonable holiday displays with each metallic snap. Now she stood in enemy territory, surrounded by an army of inflatable snowmen, synchronized light shows, and a 15-foot mechanical sander that ho-ho-hoed every 30 seconds. The Johnsons' house looked like Disney World had exploded. Every tree, bush, and surface sparkled with LED lights that pulsed to jingle bell rock pumping from hidden speakers. Cars lined the street 3 deep as families pointed and laughed at the spectacle. Margaret's jaw clenched as she watched her child press his face against her own pristine fence, leaving nose prints on the white vinyl. This was exactly what she'd warned the board about 6 months ago. "Mrs. Margaret," she spun around to find David Johnson standing in his back door, coffee mug in hand, looking more amused than alarmed. His wife Sarah appeared beside him, pulling a rope tied against the December cold. "You're on my property," David said calmly, "and you've damaged my fence. Your display violates HOA Covenant 15.3b regarding excessive ornamentation." Margaret shot back, holding up her phone. "I'm documenting violations for the board meeting." Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You cut through our fence. That's criminal destruction of property. I'm authorized to inspect for violations at 11 p.m. by breaking and entering." David's tone remained level, but his eyes had hardened. "I think you should leave now." Margaret's finger hovered over her phone screen, recording everything. The Christmas music swelled around them, Silent Night transitioning into Grandma got run over by a reindeer. The irony wasn't lost on her. This noise ordinance violation alone is grounds for immediate compliance action, she said, raising her voice over the music. "These lights are visible from space. Do you understand what this is doing to our community image?" "Our community image?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Margaret, children are lined up around the block to see your house. Families are making memories. What exactly is wrong with that?" "What's wrong is that Westbrook Estates is a prestigious community, not some carnival midway." Margaret's voice rose to match the music cut. "We have standards, rules. I didn't spend 15 years building this neighborhood's reputation to watch you turn it into a tourist attraction." David set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. "Margaret, you need to leave through the front gate this time." But Margaret was just getting warmed up. She gestured wildly at the light display, her breath forming angry clouds in the cold air. "You think this is about fun? This is about property values. About maintaining the character that makes people want to live here. When prospective buyers drive through and see this theme park disaster, what do you think happens to everyone else's investment?" "I think they see a neighborhood where people actually enjoy living," Sarah said quietly. The comment hit Margaret like a slap. She'd heard the whispers at the mailbox clusters, seen the eye rolls during board meetings, the unspoken question that followed her around Westbrook Estates. When did keeping up standards become sucking the joy out of everything? "You'll be hearing from the board," Margaret said, backing toward the fence opening. "And my attorney." "Margaret," David's voice stopped her. "You might want to look up." She followed his gaze to the second-story window where their teenage daughter held a phone, clearly recording everything. The girl waved cheerfully. "Been live streaming to TikTok for about 10 minutes now," the daughter called down. "Got the whole fence cutting thing pretty viral already." Margaret's face drained of color. She looked from the phone to the Johnsons, to the growing crowd of neighbors who'd emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Peterson from 2 doors down was filming with her iPad. The Martinez family had their whole Christmas party gathered on their front porch, watching. the drama unfolded. "This isn't over," Margaret said, her voice catching slightly. "No," David agreed, his tone almost sad. "I don't think it is." Margaret squeezed back through the hole in the fence. Bolt cutters clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, the Christmas music played on, and she could hear neighbors talking in hushed, excited voices. Someone mentioned calling the police. Someone else brought up the next board meeting. As she walked across her own perfectly manicured lawn. No lights, no decorations, just tasteful white luminarias along the walkway. Margaret felt the weight of 37 pairs of eyes watching her retreat. The really maddening part, she could still hear children laughing. Margaret sat in her pristine kitchen at 6 a.m., surrounded by printed emails, photographs, and a legal pad covered in her precise handwriting. The coffee grew cold as she worked, building what she considered an airtight case against the Johnsons' holiday assault on community standards. The doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, she could see the familiar outline of Officer Martinez from the Westbrook Police Department. "Morning, Mrs. Margaret," he said when she opened the door. "Got a complaint about property damage. Mind if I ask about your evening?" Margaret's stomach tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I was conducting an authorized inspection of covenant violations as HOA president. I have the authority to cut through someone's fence." Officer Martinez pulled out his notepad. "Because that's what the video shows." The video, Margaret's hands clenched involuntarily. She'd spent half the night watching herself go viral on social media, reading comments that ranged from mockery to outright hostility. Christmas Grinch caught red-handed. HOA Karen loses her mind over lights. The shame burned in her chest, but she pushed it down. "I need to come in and talk to you about this properly," Officer Martinez continued. "The Johnsons aren't pressing charges yet, but the damage is documented." After he left with a warning about trespassing and a suggestion that she work things out neighborly, Margaret locked the door and leaned against it. The house felt impossibly quiet around her. 22 years she'd lived in Westbrook Estates, 22 years of maintaining standards, organizing events, and keeping property values stable. She'd been HOA president for 8 years running, unopposed every election, because nobody else wanted the thankless job of maintaining order. But it hadn't always been thankless. Margaret walked to her home office and pulled out a photo album she rarely opened. The pictures showed Westbrook Estates in its early days. Smaller houses, newer families, children playing in streets not yet crowded with cars coming to gawk at light displays. There was Margaret at the first neighborhood barbecue, smiling genuinely as she handed out flyers about the new Homeowners Association. Back then, people had thanked her. The widow Mrs. Chen had brought her homemade cookies after Margaret organized volunteers to clean up storm damage. The young parents had praised her efforts to get speed bumps installed when children started riding bikes on Elm Street. When had gratitude turned to eye rolls? When had being thorough become being tyrannical? Margaret flipped to a photo of her late husband Richard at the Christmas block party 15 years ago. He loved the holiday displays. Had even suggested they put up lights themselves. "Liver, little Maggie," he'd said. "It's just Christmas." She closed the album with a sharp snap. By noon, Margaret had filed 3 separate complaints with the county. Noise ordinance violation, traffic hazard due to street parking, and electrical safety concerns. She'd also scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting for that evening and sent a certified letter to the Johnsons demanding immediate compliance with community standards. But the Johnsons weren't backing down. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as David Johnson installed a new section of fence, this one taller and topped with decorative finials. A professional security camera now pointed directly at the property line. Sarah Johnson stood nearby, talking to a man in a suit who took notes while photographing Margaret's bolt cutters, which still lay on the ground where she'd dropped them the night before. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Helen Wong, the HOA vice president, holding a manila folder and wearing an expression Margaret had never seen before. "We need to talk," Helen said without preamble. They sat in Margaret's living room. the folder between them on the glass coffee table like a loaded weapon. "The board got a petition this morning," Helen said quietly, "signed by 43 homeowners. They're calling for your resignation." Margaret felt the words hit her chest like physical blows. "Based on what grounds?" "Abuse of power, destruction of property, creating a hostile environment." Helen's voice was carefully neutral. "Margaret, I've known you for 12 years. You're not a bad person. But this situation with the Johnsons, it's gotten out of hand. I'm enforcing the covenants that everyone agreed to when they bought here. You cut through their fence at midnight." The simple statement hung in the air. Between them, Margaret opened her mouth to explain about documentation, about authority, about the importance of maintaining standards. But the words wouldn't come. "The emergency meeting tonight," Helen continued, "it's not about the Johnsons' lights anymore. It's about you." After Helen left, Margaret sat alone in her perfect living room, surrounded by tasteful neutral furniture and family photos that showed only the best moments of a life carefully curated for appearance. The silence pressed against her ears. Outside, she could hear hammering as David Johnson continued his fence repairs. The sound echoed through the quiet street like a metronome, counting down to something she couldn't stop. The community center buzzed with more energy than it had seen in years. Every folding chair was occupied, and neighbors stood 3 deep along the walls. Margaret had never seen a board meeting draw such a crowd. She sat at the head table, legal documents ranged in neat stacks before her, trying to project the authority that had sustained her through 8 years as president. But she could feel the shift in the room. The way conversations stopped when she passed, how eyes tracked her movements with something between curiosity and hostility. Helen called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address recent events concerning the Johnson family's holiday display and the response from HOA leadership." Margaret stood before Helen could continue. "I'd like to address the board and community first. There seems to be some confusion about proper enforcement procedures." "Margaret," Helen said gently, "maybe we should hear from." "I've served this community faithfully for 8 years," Margaret continued, her voice carrying across the packed room. "Every decision I've made has been about protecting property values and maintaining the standards that make Westbrook Estates desirable." From the back of the room, someone called out, "Like cutting through people's fences." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face flushed, but she pressed on. "The Johnson display violates multiple covenants, noise ordinances, lighting restrictions, and traffic flow regulations. If we don't enforce these standards consistently, they become meaningless." David Johnson stood up in the third row. "May I respond?" Helen nodded. "Mrs. Margaret, you're absolutely right that standards matter," David said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "So let's talk about standards." He pulled out his phone and connected it to the community center's projector. The wall lit up with a familiar image. Margaret cutting through the fence, bolt cutters gleaming in the Christmas lights. "This video has been viewed 2.3 million times, David continued. "But that's not why I'm showing it. I want everyone to see what happened next." The video continued past the viral clip most people had seen. It showed Margaret standing in his backyard, phone recording, as she systematically documented every aspect of the light display. Her narration was clear and methodical. Electrical outlets, decibel levels, sightline obstructions. "For 22 minutes, David said, Mrs. Margaret conducted what she clearly believed was a legitimate inspection. She wasn't vandalizing. She wasn't being malicious. She was doing what she thought was her job." The room stirred uneasily. This wasn't the confrontation people had expected. Margaret stared at the screen, watching herself work with the dedication that had defined her tenure as president. In the video, she looked less like a viral villain and more like someone desperately trying to maintain order in a world that seemed to be slipping away from each other. "But here's the problem," David continued, advancing to the next slide, a photograph of the covenant documents. "I've read every word of the HOA agreement, twice, with my attorney." Margaret's stomach dropped. There is no provision that grants the HOA president authority to enter private property for inspections. There is no clause about enforcement through trespassing, and there's definitely nothing that permits destruction of property to document violations. The room was dead quiet now. Mrs. Margaret broke the law, David said simply, not because she's a bad person, but because she confused authority with power. And there's a difference. Margaret found her voice. The board voted to give me enforcement authority to issue citations and schedule hearings. Helen interrupted quietly. Not to conduct midnight raids. Sarah Johnson stood up beside her husband. We don't want Margaret to resign. She said, surprising everyone, we want the HOA to function the way it's supposed to, with oversight, with boundaries, with respect for the people who live here. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't the vindication she'd prepared for, nor was it the crucifixion she'd feared. It was something more complicated, and somehow worse, accountability. The board has reviewed the covenants regarding holiday displays, Helen announced. The Johnson's lights are within acceptable parameters. The noise ordinance complaint was filed with incorrect decibel readings. The traffic concerns are being addressed through additional parking regulations, so they can keep their lights, called Mrs. Peterson from the middle of the room. They can keep their lights. Helen confirmed. The applause was immediate and thunderous. Margaret sat down heavily, the sound washing over her like a wave. She'd lost, not just the argument, but something deeper. The respect and trust of the community she'd spent decades trying to protect. But as the clapping died down, David Johnson approached the head table. Mrs. Margaret, he said quietly, my daughter's TikTok video got picked up by the local news. They want to do a story about neighborhoods and holiday traditions. Would you consider being interviewed to give your perspective? Margaret looked up at him, confusion replacing defeat. Why would you want that? Because, David said, I think there's more to this story than anyone realizes, and I think Westbrook Estates deserves to hear the whole truth. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled in windows throughout the neighborhood, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret wondered what Richard would have thought about all of this. The Channel 7 news van pulled up to Westbrook Estates at exactly 9 a.m., followed by a production truck and a small crowd of neighbors who got in word about the filming. Margaret stood at her front window, watching reporter Jessica Chen check her makeup in a compact mirror. She'd agreed to the interview against every instinct she possessed. But David Johnson's unexpected support had planted a seed of possibility she couldn't ignore. Maybe, just maybe, she could salvage something from this disaster. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Margaret. Jessica Chen smiled warmly, extending a manicured hand. Thank you for agreeing to talk with us. I know this has been a difficult time. They set up in Margaret's living room, the camera positioned to capture both her and the window view of the street where children were already gathering to stare at the Johnson house. Margaret had spent an hour that morning choosing her outfit. Professional, but not severe. Authoritative, but approachable. Let's start with the basics. Jessica began once the cameras rolled. You've been HOA president for 8 years. What drew you to community leadership? Margaret had rehearsed this. Answer, I moved to Westbrook Estates 22 years ago because I believed in the vision of a well-maintained, family-friendly neighborhood. When my husband Richard was alive, we both felt a responsibility to preserve that vision for future residents. Tell me about the night you cut through the Johnson's fence. The direct question hit harder than Margaret expected. I made a serious error in judgment. I was frustrated by what I saw as a violation of community standards, and I took action that was both legally wrong and personally inappropriate. I've apologized to the Johnsons, and I'm working to make amends. But you still believe their Christmas display is excessive. Margaret paused, glancing out the window where David Johnson was adjusting a blown fuse on his light display. A small crowd of children watched him work, their faces bright with anticipation. I've spent 8 years trying to balance individual expression with community harmony, she said slowly. Sometimes I've gotten that balance wrong. The Johnsons have every right to celebrate Christmas the way they choose, on their own property. Within reasonable limits, Jessica leaned forward. Sources tell me there was significant pressure from other neighbors about the light display, that you weren't acting entirely on your own initiative. Margaret's carefully prepared responses suddenly felt inadequate. Yes, there were complaints. But the decision to take enforcement action was mine alone. Can you tell me about those complaints? This was the moment Margaret had dreaded. She'd spent the last week discovering uncomfortable truths about the petition against the Johnsons, how it had started with a few neighbors concerned about traffic, then been amplified by others who resented the attention the light display brought to their quiet street. Some neighbors felt the display was bringing unwanted traffic and attention to Westbrook Estates, Margaret said carefully. Others were concerned about noise and safety issues, including complaints about property values. Margaret nodded reluctantly. What do you say to critics who suggest this was really about excluding certain types of families from the neighborhood? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Excuse me, the Johnsons are one of only 3 Hispanic families in Westbrook Estates, Jessica continued. Some residents have suggested that complaints about their excessive celebration were rooted in cultural bias. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. That's absolutely not. I would never. But even as she protested, pieces clicked into place. Mrs. Whitman's comment about those people bringing their customs to a respectable neighborhood. Bill Crawford's suggestion that the Johnsons might be happier somewhere more suited to their lifestyle. The way certain neighbors had emphasized the family's difference when filing complaints. I can assure you that enforcement decisions are made solely on the basis of covenant compliance. Margaret managed, but her voice sounded hollow even to herself. Yet the Johnsons' display was found to be within acceptable parameters. Yes. So what do you think motivated the complaints? Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, the camera recording her struggle with a truth she'd been willfully blind to. Outside, she could see David Johnson helping an elderly neighbor with her grocery bags, his daughter building a snowman with kids from 3 different families. I think, Margaret said quietly, some people were uncomfortable with joy, with celebration, with anything that made our neighborhood feel less controlled. After the news crew left, Margaret sat alone in her living room, staring at the business card Jessica Chen had left behind. The reporter's final words echoed in her mind. This story isn't over. Mrs. Margaret, the Johnsons have gotten national attention for their display. Travel bloggers are calling Westbrook Estates a must-see Christmas destination. That's not going away. Margaret walked to her window and watched families pose for photos in front of the Johnson house. A food truck had parked at the corner, selling hot chocolate and kettle corn. Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down had set up a small table selling homemade cookies, with a sign reading Westbrook Estates Welcome Committee. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Hi Mrs. Margaret, this is Sarah Johnson. Would you like to come over for hot chocolate tonight? We're having a few neighbors over to plan the New Year's celebration. Would love your input on logistics. Margaret stared at the message for a long time. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled against the December sky, and children's laughter carried on the cold air. She could hear Richard's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Live a little, Maggie. It's just Christmas. But as she reached for her coat, Margaret noticed something that made her pause. A black sedan was parked across the street, its occupant taking photos of the Johnson house with a long lens camera. The license plate wasn't local. She grabbed her phone and dialed David Johnson's number. David, it's Margaret. Don't look obvious, but there's someone photographing your house from across the street. I think your Christmas display might have attracted more attention than we realized. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in her driveway watching a convoy of tour buses navigate the narrow streets of Westbrook Estates. What had started as a local news story about HOA overreach had snowballed into something none of them had anticipated. Christmas in the suburbs, How one family's light display became a national phenomenon had been picked up by morning shows, travel magazines, and social media influencers from across the country. The Johnsons' house had become the centerpiece of what tour companies now called the Westbrook Christmas experience. Margaret's phone rang. It was Helen Wong. The board meeting started 10 minutes ago, Helen said. Where are you? Watching our neighborhood turn into a theme park, Margaret replied, stepping aside as a group of tourists with professional cameras walked past her mailbox. You need to get down here. We've got decisions to make. The community center was packed again, but this time the energy was different. Instead of anger and confrontation, Margaret sensed opportunity and excitement. Maps and charts covered the walls, showing projected traffic patterns, parking solutions, and revenue estimates. The numbers are staggering, Board Treasurer Mike Santos was saying as Margaret slipped into the back of the room. The Johnsons have received offers from 3 different production companies wanting to film holiday specials. The tourism board is projecting 50,000 visitors between now and New Year's. Margaret found an empty chair and listened as her neighbors debated something she'd never imagined: how to turn their residential street into a managed tourist destination. We need permits for the food trucks, Mrs. Peterson was saying, and liability insurance for the increased foot traffic. What about parking? Called out Bill Crawford. My driveway's been blocked twice this week. David Johnson stood up from the front row. That's why we need Margaret's help. The room fell silent. Margaret felt every eye turned toward her. I know we've had our differences, David continued, but Margaret understands logistics better than anyone here. She's been managing this community for 8 years. If we're going to do this right, if we're going to protect our neighborhood while embracing this opportunity, we need someone who knows how to organize and plan. Sarah Johnson nodded in agreement. We've been approached by the Chamber of Commerce about creating an official Westbrook Estates Christmas tour, but we can't do that without community support and professional management. Helen Wong pulled out a folder thick with documents. The proposed tour would run Thursday through Sunday, December 15th through January 2nd. Professional guides, designated parking areas, restroom facilities, and revenue sharing with participating homeowners. Revenue sharing, Margaret asked. Each house that participates gets a percentage of tour fees, Mike Santos explained. Conservative estimates suggest individual homeowners could earn $15,000 to $20,000 for the yes. Eason, Margaret felt her head spinning. You want to turn Westbrook Estates into a commercial Christmas attraction. We want to turn it into a celebration, Sarah Johnson corrected. One that benefits everyone who lives here. Over the next hour, Margaret listened as her neighbors outlined a comprehensive plan that addressed every concern she'd raised weeks earlier. Traffic flow managed through timed entry and shuttle services. Noise controlled through designated quiet hours. Safety ensured through professional security and emergency protocols. But we need someone to coordinate it all, Helen said finally. Someone who understands community management and isn't afraid to enforce rules when necessary. Margaret looked around the room at faces that had once viewed her with suspicion or frustration. Now she saw something different: respect for her organizational skills. Despite their disagreement with her methods, the position would be paid, David added, 15% of gross tour revenue, plus expenses. It's essentially a full-time job through the holiday season. After the meeting, Margaret walked home through streets transformed by possibility. The Johnsons' house still blazed with 30,000 lights, but now she saw it differently, not as a violation of community standards, but as the centerpiece of something larger. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Chen, following up on our story. Heard about the tour proposal. Interested in an update interview? Margaret paused under a streetlight, watching families take selfies in front of decorated houses throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen had strung lights along her fence. The Martinez family had put up an inflatable nativity scene. Even the usually reserved Hendersons had added twinkling icicles to their OOFLINE. Richard would have loved this, she realized, the community coming together, the children's excitement, the sense of shared celebration that had been missing from Westbrook Estates for too long. But as Margaret reached her front door, she noticed something that made her smile. A small envelope tucked under her welcome mat, with Mrs. Margaret written in a child's careful handwriting. Inside was a hand-drawn Christmas card showing a woman with bolt cutters standing next to a house. Covered in lights, at the bottom, in crayon letters, it read, "Thank you for making our street famous. Love, Emma Johnson." Margaret looked up at the Johnson's house, where the 15-foot mechanical Santa ho-ho-hoed into the night sky. For the first time in weeks, she found herself laughing along. Tomorrow, she would call Helen Wong and accept the tour coordinator position. Tonight, she was going to walk to the hardware store and buy Christmas lights for her own house. After all, Westbrook Estates had a reputation to maintain. The end.